Welcome to the Microsoft Graph community call for February. As Dana mentioned, we have a really exciting agenda coming in today. And for today's community call, just as a reminder, this is a monthly cadence. We're starting to have these calls the first of every month. In terms of what to expect from this call, we're going to be sharing what's new and what are the latest things that are coming to the Microsoft Graph. We will usually have some technical deep dives. We have some very exciting ones with coming in today from the Intune team, who just released their API GA last week. Woohoo! And at the end, we're going to do some Q&A. Okay, so this is a little bit of a recap in terms of the call agenda for today. As usual, we're going to start with a brief overview of the Microsoft Graph. We're going to dive into two specific scenarios today. One is around Intune, and the other one is around getting your data into the Microsoft Graph. We also have today our very first community participation, so we're very excited to have the folks from @Work join in the call and show us some of the work that they've done around groups automation. Okay, so with that, today we have the following folks in the room. My name is Dina Arenas. For those who haven't had the chance to meet before, I lead engineering for Microsoft Graph, and I've been with the project since its early days. And we also have Dmitry Pimenov here on the team. He leads all of the work for the SDKs and developer experiences around the Graph. And we have Dave Randall, who is a program manager in the Intune team. And we also have Toni and Martina from @Work joining us later today. So I'm going to do a brief overview of the Microsoft Graph and basically talk about high level, what is it and what can you do with it. So at the very basics, Microsoft Graph is a REST-based web API that you can use to access user group and organizational data for customers in the Microsoft Cloud. So there is a single endpoint hosted on graph.microsoft.com that aggregates data across different set of resources, whether it is users and groups in the organization that is coming across from all of the different products, whether it is Office 365, EMS, or Windows. In Office 365, we have services like Exchange, Outlook, OneNote, Planner, Excel, Teams, and many others. From the EMS side of the house, we have the Intune services, more than 17 different services coming in from Intune, and from Windows, we have some of the roaming APIs. All of these set of information is aggregated and put together underneath this single endpoint at graph.microsoft.com. So your application doesn't need to know or understand or care where the underlying data is stored. It uses just this single endpoint to get access to all of this information. And it's so much valuable because once you start integrating with one, it's very easy to add additional functionality to your application. Some of the things that you can get from the API, we have some examples of the calls here, like getting your profile information, your files, photo, your email messages, your calendar, organizational information like the reporting structure, or information about activities like the user who modified a particular file, or the people that are related to a given user, tasks, notes, and so forth. And you'll notice that, again, it's a single endpoint, graph.microsoft.com. There is two different versions, a version 1 and a version beta. The version 1 is the one that is ready for production use, and the beta is where we want you to experiment on our APIs and provide us feedback. Calling the API is very simple. The HTTP verbs indicate the request of the intent, whether it is a full CRUD API, you can get, update, and delete information, also create information. As I mentioned before, we have a V1 version and a beta version. V1 is for production use, beta is for the preview set of APIs that eventually will graduate to V1. We have a set of resources available in the API, like users, groups, sites, drives, and so forth. And then you navigate to members from that collection using a specific identifier for that member. And then you can navigate to properties of that user just by calling segments on the URL. We also have navigation properties, which is a way to traverse to related resources in the API. So for example, from a user, I can navigate to the user's files, or to the user's calendar, or to the user's email, or the devices that belong to this particular member of the collection that we are addressing. And finally, there's a set of query parameters that you can use in order to modify the response that you're getting back, whether it is selection or ordering or filtering, or doing paging with things like top and skip. Okay, so that's a high-level overview of what the Microsoft Graph is, what you can use it. So as a developer, you can think about it as a very gateway to all of the information, to all of the customer data that is sitting on Microsoft Cloud services. And with that, it simplifies your development cycle, making it very easy for you to integrate with the Microsoft Cloud. So I'm now going to hand it off to Dmitry, who's going to tell us what are some of the new things that have come up in the Microsoft Graph during the last month.
Great, thank you, Ina. So one of the things that we're really happy to announce is we have some new samples. One of the samples I want to highlight is we have a console app sample for calling into Microsoft Graph using C#. And so this is a really great sample for basically any scripting scenario that you might have. You don't have to understand any of the UI components and some of the other samples. So it's really easy to just get started making calls. You can clone this from GitHub, and you can also take a look at some of the quick starts that we have available. Next, we have batch support in V1. So for a good amount of time, we've had batch and beta, in which allows you to make multiple requests in a single request body. So you can specify, I want to make a request to OneDrive and maybe users, maybe even events, all in a single request. And the thing to note here is each of these requests is treated as if it was made independently. So this is really akin to making all of these requests in parallel, but being able to do it in a single transaction. And so the limit we've raised from 5 calls to 20 calls, so you can have a body that has 20 constituent calls and get the responses for each of those. And you can try this today in Graph Explorer. Let me open up Graph Explorer. So here I am, and I can go to some of the samples, and we have batching available here. And so you can make some parallel gets. I jump here, I can make this V1, and I can make these requests for getting both my user profile information and some of my emails. Let me sign out here. And so I can run that. It needs to be a post. And this will make all of those calls in parallel. This might take a little bit of time since some of these requests have a lot of query options on them, but might be a little bit of a bug in Graph Explorer. But regardless, this is now available in V1.0.
You want to refresh it? Refresh Graph
Yeah,
Explorer. I think it's the off piece.
Okay. Try that again really fast. We'll try this against V1 now, and then I'll run that. Hopefully this will take a little bit less time. So here I get back some of my user profile information, I get back some of my email information. And each of these has a status code that represents the HTTP status code, has the response header, so it looks like each of these appears like it's its own GET request, but I can make these in parallel, which is really quite powerful. And as I said, now you can make 20 calls in a single request response body. So today we have 3 focus topics. The first one will be led by Dave from the Intune team. So I'll hand it over to Dave, who's going to walk us through Intune, and what it means, what you can do with it, and a couple scenarios.
All right, thanks, Dmitry. So one of the things that many of you may be new to is what is the Intune service itself. So I wanted to do a little bit of stage setting and let you know what Intune is, and then we'll talk about some of the APIs that are now released in GA as of January 2018 and how you can use them. So Intune is part of Microsoft 365, and Microsoft 365 is really about allowing all of our company employees to be creative, work together, and do it securely. And the last word, securely, is really the key to what Intune provides, a set of tools that help protect company data through three different major areas. The first one is application security. So when an employee is interested in getting work done, they're going to use applications to do it. And organizations want to ensure that whether a user is using a store app, a web app, or line of business app, that app is protected for not leaking out company data to untrusted locations. So application security is the first leg. The second is device security. If you're using an iPhone or an Android or a Mac or a Windows PC, we want to make sure that they're configured in a way that has the most available security. And lastly, we want to ensure that the data that each of these devices are accessing is protected, whether that data is stored in the cloud, whether it's on the device itself, or whether it's on premises. So for each of these three areas, we have three major capabilities in Intune that I'll spend a little time talking about. App protection policies that provide application security, MDM policies that drive device security, and conditional access that prevent people from accessing data from an unsecured device. So there are three different types of ways in which you can be accessing company data. And Intune helps protect in all of these different ways by providing companies with a way to manage the devices, the applications, and the access to data. So in the first example on the left, I have a device, an iPad, that a user has brought into an organization and they don't want to have it managed by their IT. We can still protect the information that's used by that device by providing an app protection policy for things like PowerPoint, Excel, or OneDrive. And each of those applications are protected when a user logs in with their corporate credentials so that they can't transmit data outside of the application to an untrusted application. So for example, you couldn't copy and paste data out of Excel and post it into a Twitter feed if Twitter was an untrusted application. In the middle one, we have an iPhone that's managed, and oftentimes organizations will purchase iPhones either for special use, maybe they have a kiosk or a classroom device, or maybe they're using that as a approved device for a user, and the company wants to be able to protect all aspects of that particular iPhone. So the phone itself is fully managed. Or in the case of a Mac on the far right, there can be corporate-owned Macs, or using integration with one of our partners, we also have the ability to use conditional access to prevent applications on a Mac from accessing data that is outside of their scope of control. I mentioned conditional access, and this is how we tie together several different pieces of Intune. On the far left, we've got a bunch of different conditions that we can define in Intune. I'll spend a little bit of time in the UI, so some of these concepts are going to come together in a more material way. But we have a bunch of different conditions that indicate whether or not a user or the device or the application is risky. And by risky, I mean it could leak company information, or maybe the device is compromised and you wouldn't want that compromised device to access company data. So we can identify whether or not through Azure Active Directory, whether or not the user's information is at risk. Maybe their credentials have been compromised and you don't want to provide them access to company data if their credentials have been compromised. Or maybe they have applications that are risky or malware. With our partners Windows Defender, Lookout, and Skycure, we can detect whether or not applications that are installed on devices are risky. Or maybe they're in a location that we don't want them to connect from. In any of those risk conditions, we can provide a set of controls that either allow or restrict access to cloud applications such as Office 365 or other third-party SaaS applications like Box, ServiceNow, and so forth. Or we can also prevent them from accessing applications that are on premises. So if you think about it in a simple scenario, an organization doesn't want somebody who has malware on their iPhone to access their internal SharePoint drive, or maybe they don't want them to access their SharePoint files for Excel. All of these types of scenarios can be controlled and prevented using Intune. So let's go over to the console and I'll give you a little tour of how we make some of these scenarios possible in Intune. We talked a lot about device compliance, so let's take a look at how we determine whether or not a device is risky. I have a policy in Intune, and this policy, let's say for our Android device, has a set of conditions associated with it. If I navigate over to the specific conditions and I look at the device health, let's say that we want to ensure that no rooted devices are allowed to access our company data. I can set the property for rooted devices to block, and maybe I can require that Google Play Protect is configured and it has an up-to-date security provider. And maybe I require that a threat scan be run. So these are good examples of how Intune can determine whether or not a device is risky. Now we know whether it's risky or not based on these particular settings, but we haven't controlled whether or not the device has access to company data yet. So let's see where we do that. That's part of the conditional access feature. And interestingly enough, conditional access is a feature that's shared between Azure Active Directory and Intune. So as part of the overall EMS suite, conditional access is one of those pivot areas between Azure AD and Intune that provides functionality across both of those services. So I have a SharePoint Online policy for conditional access. Let's see how this works. I have one cloud app, which is SharePoint Online, and if a user is compliant with their policy, meaning their device is not rooted, they're using Google Play Protect, then I will grant them access to this particular application in SharePoint Online. And how I do that is under access controls. So for SharePoint Online, I say I want to grant access. The device must be compliant with my policies, and then I can allow that user to access SharePoint Online files. Now so this is a little bit about just kind of standard behavior for data protection using Intune. One of the other areas that I'll give you a little sample of is Intune roles. So role-based access control, common across cloud services where you want to allow administrators to have access. And if you're writing applications, you're also going to want to grant permissions to users that can call into Graph API from one or more of the Intune roles. So let's just take a look at the first level view. I have several built-in roles, and I have a couple of custom roles. So Intune allows you to define your own roles and sets of permissions for each of those roles to grant access to resources in Intune. Like for example, if I were to look at the help desk operator and take a look at the permissions that are granted, I have Android for work. This particular role can update the app sync and update onboarding, they can read the Android for work information, but they cannot update app sync or onboarding. And in a similar fashion, there's a long list of different resources that can be either granted permission to or prevented from. So when you're developing your applications that are connecting to Intune, you're going to want to make sure that you're using a role either a custom role or a built-in role that has least permissions required to make any of the Graph API calls that you're performing from your application. So let's see how that works in practice. If I go over to Graph Explorer, I've done a query here for me. So you can see my display name, the information about me is logged on user. But now using our release GA APIs, I can go to role definitions and I can get a list of all of the Intune roles just exactly the same as what we saw in the UI. So this is a good example of one of the resources that's available in Graph and some specific properties that you can explore through Graph Explorer. Getting to Graph GA, if you had a chance to take a look at the changelog, you'll notice down in the January section, once we get to the Microsoft Intune APIs, the list is rather long. It goes on and on and on and on. And we have some updates that were also made in beta as well. So if you had the opportunity to start building some automation or applications against Graph API for Intune, please make sure that you go through all of the changes, as we've made a number of changes in beta that we would like to get tested and verified and get feedback from you. And if you're developing applications, we really encourage you to make that transition over to the v10 APIs for Intune with your applications as quickly as you can. So let me summarize. The reason why I spent a little bit of time in the Azure portal for Intune, not only to give you an idea about some of the scenarios behind Intune, but Intune is a little bit unique in that everything that we do in Azure portal can be done via Graph. And the simple reason why is because our Azure portal extensions are built on top of Graph. So we call into the Graph API to do everything from Azure portal. So anything that can be done via Azure portal and Intune, you can do it via Graph. As Yina mentioned, we had 17 different feature teams that have built the APIs that were in this last month's GA release. That's over 200 different APIs and 488 supporting types that we shipped in GA. It represents about 85 to 90% of all of the API surface. So we're still doing some validation and getting feedback on a few more APIs, and those will be transitioning to GA in the coming months. So if you have some applications that are still using the ones in beta, make sure you get your feedback in so that we can ensure they're ready to go when we transition those to GA. All of the, as I mentioned, all the things you can do in Azure portal, you can do via Graph. So one of the areas that, as I talk to different developers and partners, they're interested in understanding some scenarios behind that. So anything that you can do from an administrative task perspective, maybe enroll devices, create policies, deploy applications, all of those you can do via Graph. Graph supports auditing as well, and there's an API sitting behind all of our audit events. So if you're a partner or you're interested in working with customers, or you're a customer who has a SIEM system and you want to be able to port all of those events over so that you understand changes to Intune, the auditing API is exposed via Graph. That's in preview right now. We're making our last changes, and that should go to GA in the next month or two. I talked about role-based access control. All of that is programmatically available via Graph as well. So if you want to do validation of what permissions are there, you can do that via Graph, as well as set or change permissions on roles. You can deploy applications and protection policies, or maybe if you're building a help desk application and a front end, you don't want to use the Intune Azure portal, you want to build your own application for letting help desk do remote tasks, such as a remote wipe or reset of passcode. All of those tasks and actions are programmatically available for Intune via Graph as well. One of the other folks in our team has built quite an extensive PowerShell sample script library that's available on GitHub. That contains a great set of examples that go through not just all of the requirements for authenticating, but also for just having standalone get, set, change, and remote action scripts against the Intune Graph APIs. we worked with over 20 partners to build solutions with Preview, and those are going to be transitioning over to GA as they finalize their work. There's a number of ISVs who have also been looking at enhancing and extending Intune. So don't just think about, as you're developing applications, don't just think about the specific things that Intune supports today. But I know a lot of our customers are really interested in building out the capabilities of Intune. And through the programmability with Graph API, that can be done. A lot of our enterprise customers have been engaged in the early days of Graph API, and they're anxious to get going and build their own internal automation and process extensions as well. And lastly, this community call, I think, is a great way for any of you to bring the feedback to the Intune team on how you'd like to automate and other features and functionality that you'd like to see available from Intune. So with that, I'm done. I will transition back to our next section, which is groups automation with Toni and Martina.
Yep. Let's just take a couple seconds and see if there's any questions some of the folks on the call might have.
Yeah, with regard to the Intune, we've had some specific feedback on Intune API. Can we contact you directly, Dave, or go through the Graph team? What's the best way to reach out?
Yeah, on Stack Overflow, Ask Graph is the best way to do that. I monitor the incoming questions on Stack Overflow, so that's the best way to get in touch with me. If there's also an Intune user voice. That's another way to provide feedback to the Intune team directly. I also monitor that for any Graph questions. So two options are user voice for Intune and Stack Overflow with the Ask Graph tag.
Okay, great. And then Yina just answered the other question about, is this the PowerShell Graph Intune example just mentioned? And with a link to GitHub. So, and she said yes, so I think we're good there. Are there any other questions? Let's see. Is it currently possible to create an app with app permission that allows it to use Intune Graph APIs, or is it currently user permission based?
All of our APIs still require delegation. We don't have application permissions yet. I know that this is a common request. This is something that's currently in our backlog for consideration to build out a set of APIs that support app-only permissions. One of the things that we've done in the GitHub repository is under the authentication folder, there's a PowerShell script that shows you how to securely store a password in a file. That file that contains the password is not clear text of the password. It's a hashed version of the password that's only available for that machine that it was encrypted on. So if you have scenarios where you want a non-interactive login as part of your automation, you can use that as the basis for how to securely store a password on a machine that's used to do your authentication with App Plus User.
Okay, and one more question. The file credentials is what we're currently using. Just curious what the team may be working on.
File credentials?
No, I mean, it was just a comment that to follow up on your response. I think we're good there.
Yep. Yeah, thank you for your answer. Okay, I think we are ready for the next section.
Cool. So I'm going to hand it over to Toni and Martina, who are going to be doing our partner demo for groups automation using the Microsoft Graph API.
Thank you. My name is Martina Graham, and I will briefly share our screen to the audience. So first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. It's very exciting for us that we can present one solution today, which is built on Graph. I think you currently see that. And Toni Pohl is here together with me.
Hi, guys.
So I just wanted to describe the use case why we did that solution. And it was last year. I'm currently working on a lot of large Office 365 deployments. And one of our enterprise customers has a very specific question that he said, I want to delegate Office 365 group creation. I'm unable to allow a self-service so that everybody can create its own Office 365 groups. But on the other side, I want to have kind of a self-service in place, because it's not an IT department job to make Office 365 group creation, which would definitely slow down the whole process. And they asked us to build something because they said, okay, is there an out-of-the-box solution to make Office 365 group provisioning more automated like it is today? Because at that time back, it was either go with self-service or restrict it to a specific user group or go with an IT-led solution. And we did build that, and we try to build any of our solutions based on Graph. And we created the workflow for that customer, and that means that the user has a PowerApp or a SharePoint list or whatever list, and he creates the Office 365 group in that PowerApp, and the data is sent to a SharePoint list in the backend. And then the next step is that a flow is triggered and sends an approval email to the manager of that person, that the manager can decide, okay, we already have that group, so he might reject the workflow and the flow will stop at that point. Or on the other side, he says, okay, it's a good idea to create that group, and he accepts that. And when he accepts that, an Azure function is started and will create the group and the owner in the group. And the last step in that workflow is that flow sends an email back to the sender and tells him that the group is already there and is already created. So this was the initial use case we had in there. And we did that also on an Ignite session, which is shared later in the slides, and Toni will show you the demonstration, how it works from a technical perspective.
Thanks, Martina. So I switched to my desktop, and we want to show you how we built this simple solution with standard Microsoft technology. So I logged in here in that browser in private mode with an administrator of a demo tenant. And the first thing we needed to do is we wanted to start with the Azure function that provisions an Office 365 group. So let me first show you how we started. So we went to the Graph site, to the Graph Explorer, to find out how can we create an Office 365 group. And I simply started here with the groups. I already have switched it on. And the groups in that tenant here, there are some existing here. And we can ask what kind of groups are already existing. I've prepared here my notepad somewhere. For example, show me all groups that starts with the name project or something like this. And we can simply send a post request to that Graph endpoint after we've authenticated and say create a new group. So that's the basic functionality we are using in our Azure function, and you will see that in a minute. What we need to do that, we need to create an application that has the permissions to do that for the tenant we are currently using. So the first step was to go to the Azure Active Directory, to the applications, and we created a new application in here. We did it last fall, so there are many ways to do this, but we did it manually at that time. So we created that application, starting with Martina's initials. And in here we said the permissions of this application we created. So that's the application ID. We used that. We created also a secret for that. And we added some permissions for the graph, like, for example, here's more than we need, but for example, read and write all groups. So that's the first part we started with. Then the second part was to create an application, to create let's say a list where we can store these requests. So we simply used SharePoint for that. So I simply open here the SharePoint site and go to one specific. We created one that's called Office 365 Demos. And I just want to show you the process, how we did it in here. So we went to the site content and created a new list. So let's call it provision group graph or something like this. And of course, we could add more columns to this simple list, but in our case, it's simply sufficient that we have the name of the group we want to provision in here, let's say, let's call it Adam or whatever. And this was more or less the endpoint where we store all the requests for a new Office 365 group. What else we did, we created a Power App out of that. So let's do that and start with that. Create an app. This process takes something like 2 minutes or so. We can let this run in the background. Provision group graph. So that the users can easily use the Power App for requesting a group creation in our tenant. Okay, with that, we need a place where we have the function available to use this application to create that group. And here we have several options, and I switch to another window. Here I'm in my Office, in my Azure portal, and I simply create a new Azure function, one of these existing in this container here, this app service. And I do it here out of the box, so I create a new function. And we wanted this solution to be very easy to use and easy to create. So we didn't use C# for the function, but we used PowerShell. Since many IT administrators know how to use PowerShell, so we wanted to make it really easy and really really easy to write it. So when creating a function in here, we can choose between several languages, and the experimental language support here allows us to create a function for using with PowerShell. So we created an HTTP trigger. We want a flow to start that function and said, okay, we want to have a PowerShell function, and let's name that and say that's provision group. Let's type it correctly. Graph. Something like this. We don't need any authorization level in here. And then we can start to send all the requests to the graph endpoint. So if we try this function, we will simply get, in that case, the output. That's hello Azure. Hello Azure. And if you want to follow this sample, we have blog posts describing what we did in here. And we have the sources available here in Martina's GitHub. So there's implementation for doing this group provisioning with a C# function. And there's also a function, a script for doing it with PowerShell. So I simply go in here and paste that content, and we go through that. Just first, let me paste it into this function here. So remove the existing part. And what this thing here does. First, it gets the request body, and we want to have 2 parameters out in here. That's the group name and the UPN. So let's change that. So we want to pass to this function the name of this group. So it shall be group name. And then there follows the name of that group. Let's call it, need a nice name for that. Caesar. And the second parameter, who shall be the owner of that group. And this is what the function will add simply by calling the member and the owner endpoint of the graph. So let's take a user here, and let's say I have a second user in that pane, and that's Adele. Or first, let's maybe use the administrator so that we can see it directly. So we pass 2 values to this function, and then we need an authorization. And the authorization for accessing the graph endpoint, we are getting a token from that endpoint with the tenant ID. And then we use that token here to deliver us an endpoint, to deliver us the header. We need to add the access token from the graph to the header as a bearer authorization, and then we simply start using these credentials, these tokens. So first, what we do is we get that initialization, And then we first check, is this group already existing? And here you can see what we do in here. We simply, that's the syntax of PowerShell. We say, please filter all the groups that start with the name of my group I'm passing in here. And just to be safe, I'm scrolling up a little bit. We did replacement of the email address somewhere in here. Just don't find it right now. It's not in here, somewhere below, but anyway. So first of all, we check, is the group existing? And then we simply check, okay, if it's existing, I don't need to create a new group. If it's not existing, then we do the next step. So we go to the graph endpoint and say, we do a post method with this data, with the name of the group, with the email, and so on. And the parts that are following to that is, we say we want to get the user, in that case, who shall be the owner? In our case, it's the administrator. And the last two parts, the last two steps are, we add the user as the owner of that group by adding the user object, and we also add the user as a member, and then we are done. So this is what this function here does. So I would say, let's try it out and run it here directly in the Azure portal to see if our function works. And it says invalid operation. I think I forgot the email address, so let me switch to another one, because I just tried it in here in that provision demo one. In that case, that's the admin, and our name was, let's call it Project Caesar, and run this here. I think this was the line that was missing in my copy and paste because I just added it before. So what happened in here, it seemed that it worked, that the group Project Caesar has been created. So I did this in my Azure portal and had a completely different subscription. It has nothing to do with the Office 365 tenant. That's like a remote control of the Office 365 tenant. This can run somewhere. So let's go back to our browser and go to the email of the administrator, which is somewhere here. And let's see if the groups here, we called it Project Caesar, already existing. So let's let's go to groups, folders, more, and let's discover if that group Project Caesar is already existing. So here's the one we created first, but actually I'm looking for Project Caesar, which we just created before. So here it is. And this is what this function did. It created the group, it added the user administrator as an owner, it added the user admin as member, and you can see that by simply clicking on the member here. And we can see we can now add as an owner of that group other members to that Office 365 group.
And that means it's, again, a self-service after that.
Exactly, yes. So once we have this functionality, we needed to add it to our SharePoint list, and this is done easily as well. So we are here in that Office 365 provision group graph list. Let's go to all items. We already created a PowerApp, and we attached a flow to that. And SharePoint makes it very easy for us to do that because it's built in out of the box. If I click to flow, you can see there's a start approval when a new item is added to that list. So I simply did that. And in here in the flow that is now created out of the template, we need to sign in, which is already done because we logged in into that browser with that cookie. So we see, okay, we want to access Outlook, the permissions for sending email. We want to access the SharePoint list and approval. So simply let's create that new flow. And we rename that flow. Say that's named provision group graph, provision group graph. And actually we're already almost done because we can see that there's when a new item is created and approval shall start. And in our case, we make it easy for our demo. We say, okay, the administrator is the manager. In real world, we would add the manager. We would do a lookup in Office 365 and look up for the manager of the user who created that item. And that's, I think that's the wrong. Here it is. That's the real one. the mod administrator. And we say, okay, this here sends an approval to the inbox of the creator, of the manager, and says, okay, when the response is equal to approve, if yes, then please send an email to that user, okay, your request was accepted. Otherwise, we will see that the request is denied. So let's say here, if it's denied, sorry or something like this, and here, got it. And the only thing that's missing here is we need to add an action for calling our Azure function. So I add an action here. And my action shall be calling this Azure function. So it will be just an it will be an HTTP trigger. And we just need the standard method, and the method for calling our Azure function is a post method. Then, of course, we need the URL. So let me switch the browser and go to our provision demo1 function here and copy that endpoint. So I simply copy that, go back to the other browser, say, okay, that's my method. And I don't have any headers, but I have some body as a content. So let me go back here. And here I need to paste the body, which is that. And simply use that. And of course, I don't want to pass the values hard-coded here. I need to add my dynamic content. And what I need to add here is the name of the group, which is in our case, the title of that SharePoint list, which must be somewhere here. And the second thing is who shall be the owner of that Office 365 group we create. And in that case, we simply take the creator of that item in the SharePoint list. And this is it. So let's create that flow, provision group graph, and let's see if it works. So let's go back. And in that case, I've opened another browser here. In that browser here, I'm Adele, and I want to use that provisioning flow. So I simply open my apps, go to SharePoint, and let's see if the Power App is already available for us, which is here, the Office 365 demo site. And here's our provision group graph list we just created. And we can simply switch to our provision group graph. In that case, it would take a minute to load, so I simply do it in here. So let's do something like Delta, project Delta, and save that item. So technically, that flow should start now because we added a new item to our list here. Let's go to our history. Let's see, okay, the flow started. And if we look into that flow, we should now be here at that step, start an approval. So the administrator, and I go to my Outlook here, should get an email here. If I find the right window, which is here, go back to my email and to the folders and to my inbox. And here's the email that was created by the flow. Please review. There's a pending approval for Project Delta. And then now I can say, okay, I approve it or deny it. So I submit that flow. And if you look back to the flow window here, manage your flows, you can now see, okay, this step was fulfilled. So Project Delta was accepted. And if I simply follow that flow, you can see, okay, I went into this yes part. And if you look at the HTTP method that was called, we called that endpoint with the group Project Delta, and the UPN, the owner of that new group, shall be Adele. So if I now switch back to the other browser and go to the emails, so let's maybe do it here in that window here, and opening Outlook, we should get an email that the provisioning of the Project Delta group has been approved by the administrator. And what we see is that there's already the group existing, Project Delta. So this is the new provisioned group, and we will see that I'm now, as Adele, who requested that group, I'm the owner of that group, and I can now start adding my coworkers to that group, and we can collaborate with that group. So that's the functionality, and we just used Graph as a part of this whole workflow to show what's possible with this technology by simply combining various techniques, various services. You can find the whole description of this in a three-step article in our blog, which is the URL here. If you're interested in the script or in the C# function, have a look at Martina's GitHub. That's updated there. And there's also a video recording of that session with this URL.
Yeah. So thank you for letting us do the presentation. And I think we run a little bit out of time, but I hope it was useful for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again, Toni and Martina. So I'm going to run through my technical topic a little bit quickly. I'm going to skip through some of the demos, but I have a GitHub gist with all of the demos if you want to run through them yourself. So I briefly want to talk about storage in the graph, specifically around where to store custom data. And so you might have there's a couple different scenarios, such as you might have some PowerPoint decks related to a group. You might have some photos that are created by your application. You might want to store roaming settings like theme preferences or language preferences. And there's also scenarios where you might want to store settings about a user that other apps might want to know about. And so there's a number of different mechanisms for storing data in Graph. I'm going to talk to two that are a little bit different. So there's OneDrive and SharePoint APIs, which are great for storing files. There's a lot of rich file I/O functionality like searching, being able to do some file conversion. For personal accounts, we have the notion of app folders, which lets you specify a permission scope that is scope to just modifying data within a specific application, with a specific application folder. And then we also have extensibility in Graph, where you can create augmentations to existing resources and save additional properties that are specific to your application's logic. So I'm going to sort of demystify what each of these really means. I originally had some demos, but I'm going to skip over those today. So as I mentioned, the SharePoint and OneDrive APIs really provide a lot of rich I/O functionality. You can do a direct file upload where you pass a particular content type and a serialization of that data. So this could be an image binary, this could be a text file, this could be an Excel document. And if it's a large file, we have a chunked upload mechanism. So if it's over 4 megabytes, you make a request, we'll give you back a location to make chunk to request to, where you specify the byte ranges and you can detect if you lose any packets. We provide helper functionality in our .NET SDK for chunked upload. So if you use that SDK, it's really simple to serialize large files and upload those to OneDrive or SharePoint. For personal accounts, we have this scope that allows you to store data in a specific folder that's dedicated to your application. So instead of having to ask for permissions for all of your folders, you can ask for just a specific, being able to write and read from just a specific folder. So this makes consent really easy for apps that are intended for consumers. And there's additional functionality in the form of being able to search across files, do change tracking using Delta tokens, so you can see exactly what files have changed from one point to another, and even some file conversion. So you can take a PowerPoint and convert it to a PDF, or an Excel document, create a PDF out of that. So this is really intended for custom data that's in a file-based format. So I'm going to skip over the demo slides. Again, there's going to be a gist available. I have a link on the last slide of the section. The second mechanism is extensions. So graph extensions let you add key value pairs to existing resources. These are really intended for roaming settings like theme preferences. So we don't recommend storing a lot of data here. There's restrictions on how much an app can store. And the important thing here is that there's two different kinds of extensions that you should be considerate of. So there's schema extensions, which require a registration of the shape of the extension. And then there's also open extensions, which are just appending to an extensions property bag. If you want your extensions to be used for OData querying, like filter and select, you should use a schema extension. Similarly, if you want other applications to discover the shape of your extension, you should use a schema extension. If you're storing property bag data, such as that's specific to your application, we recommend using an open extension. So again, in summary, there's a couple different mechanisms for storing custom data. If you're storing files, we recommend using OneDrive or SharePoint APIs. If you're storing app-specific data or personal accounts, we recommend using app folders. And open extensions for roaming settings. And then if you want to store general purpose data that other apps might use, we recommend using schema extensions and traditional OneDrive SharePoint scopes. And all the samples I meant to present are available in the GitHub gist. So I ran through that relatively quickly, but I also want to jump to some of the great community contributions we've received and really recognize some of the great work that's been happening around scenarios you can do with Graph. So we have had a number of blog posted videos recorded over the past month. So here are some of the external partners that have created great content. I want to just take a second and recognize all these great blog posts. There's a number of workflows around using PowerShell, automation scenarios, doing things with webhooks, where you can have event-based logic that's built around graph scenarios, and then as well as working through some of the new Microsoft authentication libraries in Xamarin. This is all really great stuff. Next, I want to jump to and just say we'll have a recording available really soon on the Office Developer YouTube, so you can watch back this video at your own leisure. The next call will be next month on March 6th. That's the first Tuesday of March. We have AKMS links for both getting the call invite as well as submitting questions. So we're going to stop the recording now and go to our question and answer section.
Oh, today we're going to do the recording we're going to continue the recording. So by popular demand, today we're going to record the Q&A session.
Okay.
And just, if we get the time, we just have a couple of minutes, so we might not get enough time to get questions from the community. We always are available on Stack Overflow monitoring the forums.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, as you mentioned, by popular demand, we're going to leave Q&A in the recording. So we had a couple questions submitted ahead of time. So one of them was, can you use Graph to search, exchange online email bodies? So yes, this is something that we support. We have an OData query option called Search that's enabled for messages. So you can search through your inbox and find messages that contain a specific set of words. There's a question that was a little bit higher level around AD B2C and Azure B2B. And so I'll take this in a couple of parts. So we have an invitation manager API available in preview, which can be used for B2B scenarios where you can invite users to your tenant. For B2C, it really depends on your scenarios. It's recommended to use some of the Azure AD Graph APIs if you want to make use of social identities and local account names until those are available in App Parity and the Microsoft Graph APIs. So that really depends on your scenarios. And then lastly, there's a question around the release velocity of .NET SDK, specifically around when will Batch come to the .NET SDK. So Batch is coming soon. We've invested a lot in SDK infrastructure, so we think that will allow us to provide new SDKs more efficiently and be able to validate our SDKs and make sure that they're of high quality. So again, thanks for submitting these questions. We had a couple questions from the call I'll briefly address. So one of them was around throttling, best practices. I think we have a document that describes some of the cases in which you want to do this. So the main scenario is that you get a 429 back, and then the 429s that you receive, that's too many requests, you will receive a retry after header, which will give you the after which you can safely retry the same request. Limits are defined by each underlying service, so there's some differences around how many requests you can make, but that's one of the best practices you can take is defensively programming against kinds of scenarios. And then I want to briefly follow up on the profile photo question around whether you can take a profile photo in Batch. So we don't yet support multi-part requests in Batch, but if you want to fetch multiple profile photos in a single batch request, that's possible. They'll come back string serialized as base 64 strings. So for instance, I can fetch my profile photo as well as my information and maybe my emails. That's all possible today. Are there any other questions from the chat?
There is one around, are you planning to align throttling headers information across workloads? Currently not working for SharePoint. So it is one of the items on our backlog on standardizing throttling practices. For now, the capabilities that we have is how the different services behave under throttling scenarios. So like Dmitry mentioned, in expecting to receive a 429 with a retry header that will tell you how much time. And then, further down the line, we have additional investments to align our throttling. Okay, with that, I think that thank you so much, everyone, for joining the call today. And we hope to see you next time on March 6th. Remember that we are also on Stack Overflow for additional questions, Stack with Microsoft Graph, and we continue monitoring the forums and providing answers there. The link to the gist for the demos that we didn't get to do today is on the IM window. And with that, thank you and have a great day or night, whatever part of the world you're in. See you all. Thank you and bye-bye.